Everyone on the ground now, shouted the first armed man as he burst through the doors of Riverside Public Library, waving what appeared to be a handgun while his partner demanded money from the circulation desk. Patrons screamed and dropped to the floor, children began crying, and staff members reached for panic buttons with trembling hands. But Margaret Sullivan, the quiet librarian who had been helping a student with research just moments before, remained standing calmly behind the reference desk, her trained eyes immediately identifying the weapons as obvious replicas, the attacker's movements as amateur and uncoordinated, and the entire situation as far less threatening than it appeared. What the terrified library patrons didn't know was that the woman in reading glasses and a cardigan, who spent her days recommending mystery novels and organizing book clubs, was Margaret Sullivan, former Secret Service agent, who had spent 15 years protecting presidents and world leaders from threats far more sophisticated and dangerous than two nervous teenagers with fake guns. Margaret Sullivan, 52 years old, had been working as head librarian at Riverside Public Library for 3 years and 8 months, maintaining the same methodical professionalism that had characterized her 15-year career protecting the most important people in American government. Every morning at 8:15 a.m., she arrived wearing comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes, carrying a worn leather briefcase that contained library administrative materials, community program notes, and reading lists for the various book clubs she organized. The community knew Margaret as a librarian who could find any book, recommend perfect reading selections for any interest, and organize events that brought together people from all backgrounds and age groups. She had transformed Riverside Public Library from a quiet book repository into a vibrant community center that hosted literacy programs, job search workshops, and cultural events that served the diverse population of their mid-sized Virginia town. What library patrons and staff didn't notice was Margaret's automatic situational awareness, the way she positioned herself with clear views of all entrances, the way she assessed every person who entered the library, the way she had quietly upgraded the facility security systems and emergency protocols without drawing attention to changes that most people would never recognize as security enhancements. Margaret had chosen library work specifically because it allowed her to serve her community in ways that felt meaningful and peaceful after 15 years of high-stress protective service. The transition from guarding presidents and foreign dignitaries to helping children with homework and adults with job applications had been exactly what she needed after a career spent constantly assessing threats and preparing for worst-case scenarios. Her Secret Service career had included assignments to presidential details, foreign dignitary protection, and counterterrorism operations that required skills in threat assessment, crisis management, and protective tactics. She had protected 3 different presidents during domestic and international travel, coordinated security for major diplomatic events, and received specialized training in everything from defensive driving to advanced firearms proficiency. When Margaret retired from the Secret Service, she had been offered lucrative positions with private security firms and corporate protection agencies. But after years of living with the constant possibility of violence, she had chosen work that would allow her to contribute to her community without requiring her to carry weapons or maintain the hypervigilance that had defined her professional life. Library work satisfied Margaret's desire to help people while providing the intellectual stimulation and community connection she had missed during her years of protective service. She found genuine satisfaction in connecting readers with books, helping students with research projects, and organizing programs that brought knowledge and culture to her community. But Margaret's protective instincts and security training never completely disappeared. She had quietly implemented security improvements at the library, developed emergency response procedures for various scenarios, and maintained a situational awareness that had kept her and her protectees safe throughout her Secret Service career. Riverside Public Library served a community of approximately 40,000 people in a town 30 miles west of Richmond, Virginia. The library's patrons included families with children, students from the local community college, senior citizens who used the facility for social connection, as well as reading, and working adults who relied on the library's computer and internet access for job searches and professional development. Margaret had developed strong relationships with regular patrons, understanding their interests, needs, and personal circumstances in ways that allowed her to provide personalized service that went far beyond typical library assistance. She knew which children were struggling with reading, which adults were dealing with unemployment, which elderly patrons lived alone and depended on library visits for social interaction. Mrs. Sullivan, said 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez during one of her regular after-school visits, can you help me find books about space exploration? I want to be an astronaut. Of course, Emma. Let's start with some age-appropriate astronomy books, and then we can look at some biographies of female astronauts who might inspire your studies. Margaret's interactions with patrons appeared to be simple library customer service, but they were informed by the same people reading skills and protective instincts she had developed during her Secret Service career. She could identify when children were dealing with problems at home, when adults were facing financial stress, when elderly patrons were experiencing health issues or social isolation. The morning when everything changed began routinely. Margaret was working at the reference desk, helping college student Jake Morrison with a research project about local history, when she noticed two young men enter the library with behavior patterns that immediately triggered her threat assessment training. The men, approximately 19 and 21 years old, entered together but separated immediately, with one moving toward the circulation desk while the other positioned himself near the children's section. Their movements were coordinated but nervous. They were scanning the library layout rather than looking for books, and they were both wearing heavy jackets despite the warm weather. Margaret's Secret Service training had taught her to recognize surveillance behavior, to identify potential threats before they became actual dangers, and to assess situations while maintaining normal activity that wouldn't alert potential attackers to her awareness of their presence. She continued helping Jake with his research while discreetly observing the two men, noting their positions, their apparent nervousness, and their focus on the library's layout rather than its contents. When they began moving simultaneously toward the circulation desk and reference area, Margaret knew she was observing the preliminary stages of some kind of incident. At 2:47 p.m., the situation escalated exactly as Margaret's training had taught her to expect. The men produced what appeared to be handguns and announced their intention to rob the library. "Everyone on the ground, now!" shouted the first man, pointing his weapon at the circulation desk where librarian Susan Chun was checking out books for a mother with two young children. "We want all the money from the register in the safe," demanded the second man, moving toward the reference desk where Margaret was standing with Jake. The response from library patrons was immediate and predictable. Screams, panic, people dropping to the floor, children crying, staff reaching for emergency alert systems. But Margaret's response was based on 15 years of training in threat assessment and crisis management. Her eyes immediately focused on the weapons, and her training allowed her to identify them as obvious replicas within seconds. The proportions were wrong. The weight distribution in the attacker's hands was inconsistent with real firearms, and the men were handling them in ways that demonstrated they had no familiarity with actual weapons. Margaret also assessed the attackers themselves, young, nervous, uncoordinated, clearly inexperienced with criminal activity, and exhibiting the behavior patterns of people who were scared and uncertain rather than dangerous and determined. "Jake," Margaret said quietly to the student beside her, "walk slowly toward the back of the library and help make sure the children are safe." Jake started to protest that they should get on the floor as demanded, but something in Margaret's calm confidence convinced him to follow her instructions. Margaret then did something that shocked everyone present. She remained standing, calmly removed her reading glasses, and addressed the armed men with the kind of professional authority that immediately changed the dynamics of the entire situation. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the library without sounding threatening or confrontational, "I need you to stop what you're doing and think carefully about your next actions." The first robber spun toward Margaret, pointing his replica weapon in her direction. "Lady, I told you to get on the ground." "Son," Margaret replied with the same calm authority, "that weapon you're holding is a plastic replica. Your partner's gun is also fake. You're committing armed robbery with toys, which makes the situation more sad than dangerous." The library fell completely silent. Patrons who had been cowering on the floor looked up in amazement at the librarian, who was calmly confronting armed robbers. Staff members stopped reaching for panic buttons and stared at Margaret's inexplicable confidence. The second robber moved closer to Margaret, trying to regain control of the situation. "You don't know what you're talking about, lady. These are real guns, and you need to shut up and get down." Margaret looked directly at the young man with the kind of steady gaze she had once used when identifying potential threats to presidential security. Young man, I've been looking at weapons and assessing threats for more years than you've been alive. Those are replica firearms, probably purchased at a sporting goods store or online. They're designed to look realistic from a distance, but they're obviously fake to anyone with training. Margaret then took a step closer to the first robber, moving with the controlled confidence of someone who had disarmed actual threats in real security situations. More importantly, she continued, you're both scared, inexperienced, and making decisions that are going to ruin your lives. This library has multiple security cameras. At least 6 people have already activated emergency alerts, and police response time to this location is approximately 4 minutes. The robbers looked at each other with growing uncertainty. They had expected fear and compliance, not calm analysis and professional threat assessment from a middle-aged librarian. But here's what I'm going to do, Margaret said, reaching slowly into her cardigan pocket while maintaining eye contact with both men. I'm going to show you my identification, and then we're going to have a conversation about better choices. Margaret pulled out her wallet and displayed her retired Secret Service credentials, which she still carried out of habit rather than necessity. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I spent 15 years as a Secret Service agent protecting presidents and other government officials. I've been trained to recognize real threats, assess dangerous situations, and neutralize problems before they become tragedies. The effect on the robbers was immediate and complete. The first young man lowered his replica weapon, his mouth falling open in shock. The second robber took several steps backward, clearly overwhelmed by the realization that they had chosen to rob a library protected by a former federal agent. Now, Margaret continued in the same calm, professional voice, you're going to put those toys down, take a seat at that table, and wait for the police officers who are already on their way. Then we're going to talk about how 2 young men with no serious criminal history can make better decisions about their futures. The attempted robbery effectively ended at that moment. Both young men complied with Margaret's instructions, sitting at a library table while she maintained visual supervision and waited for police response. Library patrons slowly stood up, looking between the subdued robbers and the librarian, who had somehow transformed a terrifying situation into what appeared to be a community intervention. Mrs. Sullivan, whispered Emma Rodriguez, the 10-year-old who regularly visited the library, are you really a Secret Service agent? I was, Emma. Now I'm a librarian who helps people find books and sometimes helps them make better choices. Police arrived within 6 minutes, finding a scene that was unlike any armed robbery response they had ever encountered. Instead of ongoing crisis or aftermath trauma, they found 2 dejected young men sitting quietly at a library table while a librarian in a cardigan provided calm briefing about the incident. Officers, Margaret said as police entered the library, these are the 2 individuals who attempted to rob the library using replica firearms. They've been cooperative since realizing their mistake, and I believe this incident represents poor judgment rather than serious criminal intent. Officer David Park, the first responder, recognized Margaret from community events, but had never known about her law enforcement background. Mrs. Sullivan, can you explain what happened here? Margaret provided a systematic debriefing that demonstrated her law enforcement experience, detailed observation of the suspect's behavior, accurate assessment of the threat level, and professional recommendations for handling the situation that impressed the responding officers. Ma'am, said Officer Park after hearing Margaret's account, your response to the situation was exceptional. How did you know the weapons were fake? 15 years of Secret Service training teaches you to identify real threats very quickly. These young men were scared and desperate, but they weren't dangerous. The investigation that followed revealed that the attempted robbers were Tyler Jackson, 19, and Marcus Williams, 21, both unemployed local residents who had planned the library robbery because they believed it would be an easy target with minimal security and available cash. What they hadn't researched was that libraries typically have very little cash on hand, that Riverside Public Library had extensive security systems, or that their target facility was protected by someone with federal law enforcement training. During police interviews, both young men expressed remorse for their actions and amazement at Margaret's response to their attempted crime. Officer Tyler Jackson said during his interview, When she showed us that Secret Service badge, I realized we made the stupidest mistake of our lives. She could have had us arrested or worse, but instead she talked to us like we were people who could do better. Margaret's intervention with the police on behalf of Tyler and Marcus reflected her understanding that the incident represented poor decision-making rather than serious criminal intent. She recommended community service, job training programs, and counseling rather than incarceration for first-time offenders who had used replica weapons and caused no physical harm. Her recommendations were taken seriously by both police and prosecutors, leading to plea agreements that emphasized rehabilitation rather than punishment for the two young men. But the incident had revealed Margaret's background to her entire community, ending 3 years of quiet anonymity and requiring her to address questions about her transition from Federal Protection Service to library work. The day after the attempted robbery, Margaret arrived at work to find the library filled with flowers, thank you cards, and community members who wanted to express their appreciation for her protection of the library and everyone in it. Mrs. Sullivan, said Library Board Chairman Robertson during an impromptu community gathering, we want to thank you not just for stopping the robbery, but for 3 years of service that we now realize was much more professional and protective than we understood. Margaret realized that her community was grateful not just for her response to the robbery, but for the security and professionalism she had brought to the library throughout her tenure. I appreciate your thanks, Margaret replied, but I want you to understand that my previous career doesn't change my commitment to library work. I chose this job because I believe libraries are important for communities, and protecting this library means protecting something that serves all of you. The weeks following the incident brought unexpected opportunity for Margaret to integrate her Secret Service experience with her library work in ways that benefited the entire community. She was invited to speak at schools about careers in law enforcement, to consult with local businesses about security improvements, and to work with the police department on community safety programs. But Margaret also received an offer that surprised her. The county library system asked her to develop security protocols for all library branches, applying her federal law enforcement experience to protect library staff and patrons throughout the region. Margaret, said County Library Director Linda Martinez, your response to the robbery demonstrated that libraries need security expertise, but security that fits with our mission of open access and community service. Would you consider developing training programs for library staff? Margaret accepted the position while continuing her work as head librarian at Riverside. The combination allowed her to use her protective expertise to benefit libraries throughout the county while maintaining the community connection and literary focus that had drawn her to library work. Her security training programs for library staff emphasized de-escalation techniques, threat assessment, and emergency response procedures that protected both staff and patrons without creating an intimidating environment that would discourage library use. The goal, Margaret explained to library staff during one of her training sessions, is to create an environment that is safe and welcoming. Good security should be invisible to people who aren't causing problems, but immediately effective when real issues arise. 6 months after the attempted robbery, Margaret received recognition from both the American Library Association and the Virginia Department of Public Safety for developing security protocols that balance library accessibility with community protection. But the recognition that meant the most to Margaret came from Tyler Jackson and Marcus Williams, the 2 young men who had attempted to rob her library. Both had completed community service requirements, enrolled in job training programs, and found employment in their community. Tyler was working as a maintenance assistant at a local school, and Marcus had been hired by a construction company that specialized in community improvement projects. Mrs. Sullivan, Tyler said when he visited the library 6 months after the incident, I want to thank you for giving us a second chance. You could have had us arrested and prosecuted, but instead you helped us understand that we could make better choices. Tyler, everyone deserved the opportunity to learn from their mistakes and build better lives. I'm glad you and Marcus took advantage of that opportunity. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Why did you become a librarian after being a Secret Service agent? Margaret considered the question carefully, because protecting people doesn't always require weapons or badges. Sometimes the best protection involves helping people find information, learn new skills, and build stronger communities. A year after the attempted robbery, Margaret had become a recognized expert in library security and was regularly invited to speak at library conferences and law enforcement training events. Her presentation at the National Library Security Conference focused on the principle that had guided her response to the Riverside incident. The most effective protection comes not from creating barriers between people and resources, but from understanding threats accurately and responding proportionally. Margaret's story had also inspired other former law enforcement and military personnel to consider library careers, leading to a new recruitment initiative that connected veterans and retired federal agents with library systems seeking experienced, security-minded staff. Margaret, said Emma Rodriguez, now 11 years old and still a regular library visitor, I read an article about you in the newspaper. You're famous now. Emma, I'm the same librarian who helps you find books about space exploration. The only difference is that now people know I have experience with security as well as literature. Mrs. Sullivan, do you think I could be a Secret Service agent and a librarian? Emma, I think you could be anything you want to be. The important thing is finding work that lets you help people and serve your community. Today, Margaret Sullivan continues working as head librarian at Riverside Public Library while also serving as county library security coordinator. She still helps children find books about space exploration, assists adults with job searches, and organizes book clubs that bring the community together. But she also provides security training for library staff, consults with law enforcement on community protection issues, and speaks at conferences about balancing security needs with public service missions. The attempted robbery that revealed her Secret Service background led to opportunities to integrate her protective expertise with her commitment to library service, creating a career that uses all of her skills in service of her community. Margaret's story reminds us that protective expertise doesn't diminish when applied to civilian service. It enhances. That Secret Service training can improve library security just as effectively as it protects presidents. That the same skills used to assess threats to national leaders can be used to identify and prevent problems in community institutions. The next time you visit your local library, remember Margaret Sullivan. Remember that the librarian helping you find books might have experience and training that goes far beyond literature and information science. Remember that they might have chosen library work not because they lack other qualifications, but because they found meaningful ways to apply extraordinary skills to ordinary community service. Sometimes the most important protection happens not in government buildings or diplomatic events, but in public libraries where former federal agents choose to use their expertise to keep communities safe while promoting literacy, learning, and open access to information. Sometimes the greatest act of service involves not dramatic security operations, but daily choices to apply specialized training to civilian benefit, ensuring that the skills developed for protecting national leaders can be used to protect local communities. We need to recognize and appreciate the skilled professionals among us who've chosen to serve quietly, especially those whose previous service required protecting important people in dangerous situations, so that ordinary people could feel safe in peaceful places. Because true protective expertise doesn't disappear when badges are retired. It just finds new applications. And sometimes the most valuable security training involves not stopping international threats, but recognizing that libraries, schools, and community centers are worth protecting because they serve the people who make democracy and freedom meaningful.